fellow panelists and all of you for coming here early on a Saturday morning. It is the nature, I think has been suggested, of the American political process that presidents campaign outside history. And then when they enter the Oval Office, they find they have to live within it, within history. In a campaign, the candidate articulates broad goals and intentions and swears that under his or her stewardship that the world will be a better, brighter place. In the case of Barack Obama, this meant promising a speedy and honorable withdrawal from Iraq, a sharper, more effective focus on defeating al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, firm but respectful relations with China and Russia, engagement with intractable opponents like Iran and Cuba, and meaningful progress with our best collaborators on economic and environmental problems. All of this was wonderful, of course, and practicable to the extent that he could count upon Congress, the American public, foreign governments, global bankers, and international terrorists for steady help and cooperation. But what President Obama learned from history is that when one steps into the Oval Office, one steps into a role that is severely constrained by a wide variety of pre-existing pledges. As teachers of American history, we are often required to explain why the U.S. commitment to Vietnam spanned nearly, or non-communist South Vietnam, spanned nearly 30 years, beginning with Truman's financial support of the colonial war against the Viet Minh, and ending with Richard Nixon's Christmas bombing of Hanoi. Why were there 5 Vietnam presidents? Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, all as different as men can be from one another in terms of personality, experience, and outlook. The answer is that each stepped into the same policy straitjacket that allowed for only the smallest wiggle room. This, of course, was the policy of containment. Perhaps the most telling and perhaps even chilling document of the Vietnam era is the extraordinarily brief assessment drawn up by defense analyst John McNaughton in 1965, in which he assigned percentages to the reasons for the U.S. commitment to an independent South Vietnam. This is what he said: 70% to avoid a humiliating U.S. defeat to our reputation as a guarantor, 20% to help keep South Vietnam and the adjacent territory from the Chinese hands, 10% to permit the people of South Vietnam to enjoy a better, freer way of life. When I first read this document a number of years ago, I was horrified that the most important reason was to protect America's reputation, to save face, in other words, to look good, to protect, I thought then, our pride. But I came to realize that this reading was actually a naive one on my part. The U.S. reputation as a guarantor, as you put it, meant something much more important, in fact, than pride. The precarious stability of the post-war world was, in fact, entirely predicated upon the guarantees that the U.S. made after the horrors of the wars against Hitler and Hirohito, after Pearl Harbor, Stalingrad, Auschwitz, Nagasaki. In the Marshall Plan, in the chartering of the United Nations, in its decision to join the European Defense Coalition, known as the Brussels Treaty Organization, that became NATO, the U.S. pledged itself to be there for the world community and not to ever withdraw again behind its lovely wide oceans, one of which is about 100 feet away. And so every crisis had the potential to become a litmus test of American resolve to play this role to the end of time. And it wasn't merely an abstract problem. The commitment to hold the line at the 17th parallel in Vietnam took place in the context of the life and death struggle to hold the line at the 38th parallel in Korea, and the line drawn by the Brandenburg Gates across Berlin, the Manichaean dualisms and strategic stalemates of North and South Vietnam, North and South Korea, East and West Berlin, were of a piece. Of course, dissidents at the time, and many of us today, would argue that these were all very different situations with disparate casts of characters and unique origins. We might even argue that the commitment to South Vietnam endangered the commitment to South Korea and West Berlin. But international credibility, like business confidence in an economic downturn, is easier to describe than it is to create and sustain. And so, 5 Vietnam War presidents found themselves in the same impossible position, pursuing a policy that helped them do 2 things. 1, prove their reliability to allies who counted upon the U.S. to underwrite global security and economic well-being. 2, to sustain a credible threat to enemies and frenemies. You know, any high school students with enemies, friends like this, who needs enemies? So frenemies, you might think of as like Saudi Arabia, for example. There's to sustain a credible threat in order to ward off incidents of aggression that might once again lead to world war. It seemed to many that when the Cold War ended in the 1990s, that all of the nations of the world, including the U.S., were finally free of its tyrannical embrace, free of the policy straitjacket that required U.S. presidents to weigh every choice in terms of its effect, possible effect, on the fragile ceasefire. That was the Cold War. But the first decade of this century showed this hope was premature. The Soviet threat, indeed, the whole Soviet Union went away. But what was essentially unchanged, what's still unchanged, was the American guarantee of global security and the global economy. And with it, the unchanging requirement that the United States continually prove its reliability to its weaker allies and the credibility of its threat to those who appear to threaten the system. Why us? One might reasonably ask. Who else? After the catastrophic devastation of German, Japanese, British, Russian, Western European industry in World War II, there was only one man left standing. And the U.S. implicitly took upon itself the burden of international security. When the Russian Federation replaced the Soviet Union in 1991, this position became, if anything, more explicit. We entered what some political scientists called a unipolar age.